In today's episode, I'm joined by Carwyn Jones, he tōhungaroia Māori, he kaiako, who's spent years teaching lawyers about Te Tiriti. How significant is Te Tiriti to our country?
Well, Te Tiriti is really significant to our country and to all the peoples who are here, partly because it's a reflection and a recognition of the tino rangatiratanga that Māori continue to exercise, but also it provides a space for everyone else here in Aotearoa to be here under the authority of kāwanatanga. So he whakaputanga in 1835 reflected the fact that Māori exercised tino rangatiratanga, exercised authority here in Aotearoa, and nobody else did. And what Te Tiriti does is it provides that space for everyone to be here.
Today's kōrero is going to delve deep into the Waitangi Tribunal and also treaty settlements, both things that are quite tricky to understand, but we'll do our best to unpack it all. Carwyn Jones, ka tai awhi o te omaki o ngā mihi ki a koe. Thank you so much for taking the time to come and have a kōrero about this very important kaupapa on our podcast. I te tuatahi, can you whakamohio mai kia mātou ko wai koe?
Ai, tēnā koe. Ko Carwyn tōku ingoa, he uri ahau no Ngāti Kahungunu ki te Wairoa, and I'm a kaihautu of te whare whakatupu mātauranga at Te Wānanga o Raukawa, and I teach into the Māori Laws and Philosophy program there, and I'm an I'm an honorary adjunct professor at Te Kawa Māui at Victoria University of Wellington. Yeah, well.
So in your role as a kaiako, as a teacher, what is your main focus of teaching?
So I focus particularly on, at the moment at Te Wānanga o Raukawa, thinking about tikanga as a legal system, as the first law of Aotearoa, and also as part of that thinking about Te Tiriti o Waitangi and the ways in which Pākehā law has had an impact on both Te Tiriti o Waitangi and tikanga Māori.
Kia tīmata ake tātou ki te Waitangi Tribunal. It's pretty interesting. Lots of people know, you hear about the Waitangi Tribunal and these reports that they do and the mahi that they do, but not that many people know why we have it, how it started, and why there's actually a need for it.
Yeah, sure. So the Waitangi Tribunal was set up in 1975, and it comes hot on the heels, really, of the 1975 Land March, the Hikoi, that many people might be familiar with. And it's really important in terms of the way in which this was the kind of first time that there's the establishment of the tribunal meant that there was an avenue, a legal avenue, to bring claims which were purely based on the principles of the Treaty of Waitangi, is the phrase that's used in the legislation. And before that, there had been, infamously a very early case of Wee Parata and the Bishop of Wellington from the 19th century, which had said the treaty was a simple nullity. And so we had continued on with this position where the treaty by itself was not able to be enforced in law. You couldn't just go to court based on the Treaty of Waitangi. And so what we have in 1975, when the Waitangi Tribunal is established, is a body that can hear claims based on the principles of the Treaty of Waitangi.
Nō reira, ka ea te hikoi a kahurangi whenakupa I te tau whetū te kaumarima, ka tū hoki te Waitangi Tribunal, a group made up of judges, experts, historians and academics who look into breaches of Te Tiriti. Prior to this, the treaty didn't really exist in politics. Ahakoa kaore ngā here a te tribunara, he mana tō ā rātou kupu.
So the tribunal is largely a recommendatory body, so it makes recommendations to government. It inquires into claims and makes findings and recommendations, and then government can decide whether to follow those recommendations or not. there are a small number of situations where the tribunal does have binding powers, and these came about as a result of litigation through the courts in the 1980s and 1990s, where the tribunal, and this is largely in relation to, or I should say only, in relation to former state-owned enterprise land and Crown Forest licence land. So there are these two exceptions to the tribunal's recommendatory power, where it can make binding orders that those lands are returned to Māori. Now, the tribunal has never exercised those powers.
Was that state-owned enterprise act thing that you mentioned, was that actually the beginning of where the treaty principles started as well?
So there's a quite a famous case that goes to the Court of Appeal, which is often talked about as the state-owned enterprises case, or sometimes the land case. And that was the first time that the Court of Appeal was dealing with the concept of the principles of the treaty. So the Waitangi Tribunal had been working with this term, the principles of the treaty, in its own legislation and jurisdiction since 1975. But then it's in 1987 where, after this phrase, the principles of the Treaty of Waitangi, is used in the State-Owned Enterprises Act. This comes as part of the big reorganisation of the public sector in the 1980s under the Longi Labour government and Rogernomics and all those big changes around the economy and the public sector. The State-Owned Enterprises Act was going to make what had formerly been government agencies or ministries, was going to turn some of those into companies that would be owned by the government. Some of those companies had significant land holdings, and the concern that the New Zealand Māori Council had was that that land, which had formerly been part of the Crown's asset base and may have been able to be returned in settlement, was going to be put out of reach of being able to be used for settlement purposes, the settlement of historical claims. So the legislation, the State-Owned Enterprises Act, had this provision in it which provided that nothing in the Act would allow the government to act inconsistently with the principles of the Treaty of Waitangi. And so that became the mechanism by which the New Zealand Māori Council could bring this case, and it was the first time that really the courts, as opposed to the Waitangi Tribunal, were engaging with this concept of the principles of the Treaty of Waitangi. And so, of course, had to figure out how to interpret what that phrase meant and apply that. And the court in that case really identified three key principles that were relevant there. It was a principle of partnership, so that the treaty partners were required to act with utmost good faith towards each other. A principle of active protection, so that the Crown has a positive duty to protect those taonga which are covered by Article 2 of Te Tiriti, and also a principle of redress, so that where there have been breaches of Te Tiriti, that the Crown has an obligation to provide some form of redress to address those.
And because you mentioned the Māori Council there as well, it's great that they had the kind of forethought to think, wow, if we ever do get some land back, we need to have those systems in place.
The Waitangi Tribunal is coming up 50 years, and we need it now more than ever to be a voice for us. But it's under attack by the current government.
One of the things, that I think has been really important about the work that the Waitangi Tribunal has done is to set out a lot of that history and to set it out in kind of local context. So people, if they want to, can go and look at Waitangi Tribunal reports which relate to their, the places they know, the places that they grew up, and read what that history was like. Read about the history of not just the local iwi, but the way in which the Crown engaged with the local iwi, and understand why this street name is named after this colonial official, why this street name's named after this rangatira, all those kinds of things.
Speaking about the Waitangi Tribunal, what have been some of their biggest findings?
So the tribunal has this jurisdiction, is partly a historical jurisdiction, and the historical claims have largely been dealt with through these big district inquiries. And so in each of those big district inquiries, you see important findings about, particularly around land loss and the loss of control over natural resources often. So those are really significant in each of those particular districts in which they apply. But the tribunal also has this jurisdiction, has always had a jurisdiction around kind of contemporary policy issues, and in fact now is not able to receive any new claims about historical issues. So it's continuing to complete some of those historical claims, but its focus now very much is on the contemporary policy kinds of issues. Some of the big findings that the tribunal has made, I think we're in Te Wiki o Te Reo Māori as we're recording this, and one of the, I think, most important findings the tribunal made was in relation to the Te Reo claim, the 1980s, which led quite directly to Te Reo Māori being recognised as an official language, to the establishment of Te Taurawhiri Te Reo, the Māori Language Commission, and so had quite an impact on those areas. We also saw more recently things like there's an ongoing inquiry into hauora, health and various dimensions of that, and that's a big inquiry. The first stage of that inquiry recommended that the government investigate establishing an independent Māori health authority, and the previous government, of course, followed through on that and did establish that, since being disestablished. But again, I think a kind of important statement there.
Didn't they rule that Ngāpuhi never ceded sovereignty?
Yes.
Yay! Tēnā koe Waitangi Tribunal.
Yeah, so this was in 2014 in the first stage of the Te Paparahi o Te Raki inquiry, so essentially the Ngāpuhi claims. And of course the tribunal had for a long time been engaged in questions of interpreting and applying Te Tiriti and the principles of the treaty in all its inquiries. But in the Ngāpuhi claims, in this inquiry in particular, there was a much greater focus on thinking about he whakaputanga, the 1835 Declaration of Independence, and its relationship to Te Tiriti, and understanding the context of what was meant by those people who were signing Te Tiriti at Waitangi on the 6th of February in 1840 in particular. And the Waitangi Tribunal said there that they most certainly were not ceding sovereignty by signing Te Tiriti. Now that was actually consistent with where the historical evidence, the legal evidence had been for some time, but this was the first time in which the tribunal said that kind of quite so boldly.
There are hundreds of reports and they're all accessible online on the Waitangi Tribunal website. Some really interesting reads and findings on there if you're interested. Anyway, 10 years after the Waitangi Tribunal was established, in 1985 the tribunal was allowed to look into historical breaches, which started the process of what we now know as treaty settlements.
Do you know where the concept of treaty settlements came from?
Well, part of the Waitangi Tribunal process meant that as these claims started to come through, that there needed to be some way of providing some form of redress or dealing with
just something,
this.
just a little something.
Yeah. Some way, and what became clear was that it was going to be helpful to have a more systematic process than dealing on an ad hoc basis with each claim as it finished going through the Waitangi Tribunal. The Waitangi Tribunal itself commissioned a series of these, what they call rangahau whānui, or the kind of national overview reports. And so these reports covered a whole series of different themes that might be coming through claims. They looked at different areas of the country to see what sort of claims were likely to be out there. And that enabled the Waitangi Tribunal to sort of organise its own processes in a way, and it started, rather than hearing, an individual claim as it came in, it would group claims together in a district and hear a whole district's worth of claims together. But it also enabled the government to think about, what are the claims that are out there, and to try and, put together a more systematic process around settling those claims.
Yeah.
And so that's essentially the part of how the modern settlement process has developed. At the time of the lands case in 1987, there was no kind of systematic process for settling claims. But part of the reason why the New Zealand Māori Council was particularly concerned about this issue was that it was only in 1985 that the Waitangi Tribunal had got this historical jurisdiction. So when it's first set up in 1975, the Waitangi Tribunal is only able to look at claims which relate to Crown actions from 1975 onwards.
Oh, wow. So not all the way back from all the bad things they did when they took all of our land.
That's correct, yeah. And so as you sort of suggested there, it's actually, in that earlier period that you have some of the most significant land loss. And so in 1985, the Waitangi Tribunal's jurisdiction is extended to have this historical jurisdiction so that it can hear claims going all the way back to 1840. Now, why the Māori Council is concerned is that there hasn't really been an opportunity for any of those claims to be heard by the time the State-Owned Enterprises Act is passed the following year. Right. And this potential that, we might have got the ability to have these claims heard, but suddenly there might be no land available to provide redress for those claims.
Yeah, it's because how complicated is the settlement process?
Yeah, so the settlement process...
Very complicated by the look on your face.
is complicated and, takes a lot of time and energy and resources on behalf of iwi and those groups who are going through the settlement process.
And so we do talk about settlement and we talk about redress, like how, for redress, are we actually getting back even like the tiniest percentage of the land that we lost?
So one of the things in the settlement process is that often there isn't actually a whole lot of land that is returned, and that's one of the hard things, obviously, to talk with people who are going through the settlement process. I know through our own settlement negotiations in Wairoa that some of those conversations early on about what you can expect from the settlement were really difficult because people felt if land has been taken,
then we should get it all back.
Then we should get it back.
Yeah.
In actual fact, a lot of the land around Wairoa that we would have sought to have returned was no longer in Crown ownership. It was in private ownership, and so not available to be used in settlements. You can't
really just turn up and knock on the door and be like, "Kia ora, I've come to take my land back."
No, exactly. Yeah, and so it falls outside of the parameters of what the Crown is willing and able to talk about in settlement negotiations.
Yeah. When you look at those figures, do you actually have a number on how much we lost?
I don't have a number.
An actual number, but, a ballpark.
Yeah, I'm not sure what the kind of total would be, but, I do know that the estimates in terms of what gets the value of settlements, the kind of commercial or financial value of settlements as compared to what was lost, is estimated to be, on average, in the range of 1% to 2% of the value of what was taken in breach of Te Tiriti. And I know, for example, in the Waikato Tainui settlement, which was one of the first settlements under this new process, that it actually acknowledges in the settlement agreement that the value to the Crown of the land that had been taken, or the value to the country, was estimated to be $12 billion, and they received a settlement of $170 million.
Yeah.
And now they also, I should note, they were settling under what we termed the fiscal envelope, this kind of $1 billion cap that was intended to cover all settlements. So that $1 billion cap wouldn't have even covered the value of the Tainui settlement.
Yeah. Now, I do think it's really important to make the point here. It's been a common narrative from Pākehā that Māori get all these special privileges, but we haven't even had 2% of what was taken from us given back. And people say we need to move on, but it just doesn't work like that. In 1995, the government even tried to say that $1 billion would cover all of our settlements. Get out of here. Where does the pūtea actually go? I know that, Tainui, Ngai Tahu, it gets given to the area, but then what happens to the money?
Yeah, so with each settlement, before any settlement assets are handed over, the settling group has to set up what's called a PSGE, a post-settlement governance entity.
Okay.
And these PSGEs have to meet certain requirements that the Crown sets in terms of being representative and accountable and transparent, and they need to be also ratified by the settling community to say, this is the body that's going to manage our settlement assets for us.
Yeah.
And so those bodies then receive the settlement assets, and they, will undertake a number of different kinds of things. They will all usually have some kind of commercial investment arm, and with the settlements, there's often some commercial redress that is provided. But what they will usually also have a kind of community development arm or some other part of the organisational structure which will be responsible for thinking about how, where there are profits that are derived from the commercial activities of the group, how they are fed back into the community. And, that happens. There are lots of different ways in which that happens. We see things like educational scholarships and so forth.
Yeah, I got one of those.
Yeah.
Tēnā koe tainui.
And, Ngai Tahu set up a sort of saving scheme, which is a bit like a KiwiSaver scheme.
Yeah.
So those kinds of things which allows people to save and be supported in saving for, similar kinds of purposes for KiwiSaver, but, might include to be put towards education or first house or retirement, those kinds of things.
And so lots of people do think that these settlements are full and proper, and in your experience, do you think people agree with that? Do you agree with that? Is that kind of their whakaaro when these settlements are finished, that everybody's happy with the outcome?
No, I wouldn't say happy with the outcome. One of the things, again, I think the conversations that we can have as, going through the settlement process is to recognise that, we are only expecting a very small percentage of the value, even in the very best case scenarios.
Yeah.
And it's not going to resolve, it's not going to heal all the mamae. But what it may do, and what we hope that it does, is that it provides a platform for us to start to undertake our own activities, to start to have a bit more self-determination, to build better relationships with both local government and central government. So the settlements themselves, I think, ought to be seen as a reset or even just the beginning of a new relationship in a way. And if those settlements kind of only stay as they are signed, the relationships with central and local government don't develop beyond that, then I think they're going to have a very limited purpose, because they're a limited pool of money or commercial redress. Yeah. And really, I think a lot of the benefit from the settlements will come from the different kinds of relationships that we're able to establish. Certainly that's one of the hopes for us in Wairoa is that we've put quite a lot of emphasis on trying to think about how we can deliver for our members by having input into local government, into social and economic policy so far as it affects our members in the Wairoa area.
Yeah. Do you think that we're on track to finishing the settlements? Like when is it all going to be settled?
Yeah, so I think one of the things to remember is that these settlements are only addressing historical claims, and historical claims are those which are defined as relating to Crown activity which took place before 1992. Yeah. So 1992 is the kind of cut-off for historical claims, and that's because that's the date in which the Sea Lords settlement, the settlement in relation to commercial fisheries, the Crown agreed a set of principles as to how these modern settlements were going to take place. So they're only settling those historical claims. What we've seen is that the Crown continues to breach Te Tiriti and the principles of the treaty. And so I think so long as the Crown is still breaching Te Tiriti, then there's still going to be some work to do in thinking about how those are resolved.
Put a dollar value on the whenua that we lost and work that out in the settlements process.
Yeah, so it's not I don't know that there's a sort of exact science, but, this is the kind of work that often economists are involved in modelling as to what the value of land that was taken, when we can identify areas of land that have been taken in breach of Te Tiriti, whether that's through confiscation or activities of the native, as a result of native land court activity, or through what are often coerced purchases of land as well. So we can identify those areas of land, and those are identified through treaty settlement negotiations and through tribunal inquiries as well, of course. And the Crown acknowledges where those breaches of Te Tiriti have been made. So those areas of land can be identified, and then it's a process, the usual kind of process of land valuation that takes place in terms of identifying what the kind of total value of that might look like. And it's not an exact science, but those are the kinds of estimates that we've seen.
And hard for Māori too, because historically we never had like a singular ownership view or whakaaro when it came to land. It was owned by everyone, right?
Yeah, so certainly part of a number of the issues that we see involving Māori land today come as a result of the work of the Native Land Court in the 19th century and into the 20th century, which has, changed the ways in which changed our relationships with each other and with the whenua in regards to land ownership. Because
what was that not something set up by Māori, the Native Land Court?
No. So the Native Land Court was set up in the 1860s, and it was specifically set up to make it easier for Māori to sell land, or for settlers and the Crown to take land, exactly. And so its functions were to identify who held the customary ownership, so kind of in a tikanga Māori sense, who would you say was the owner, if there was an owner, and then to convert that ownership into a form of title that can be bought and sold easily. And it was very effective at that work.
Yeah, really wasn't it?
He reka katoa e nei kōrero, ko te tūmanako kua mārama e tahi wāhanga o ngā mahi a te tribunal I nāianei. We're going to move on now to a kaupapa that Carwyn's been heavily involved with, tikanga, the first law of the land.
One of your main areas of rangahau and research and your teaching is talking about how, tikanga, Māori, affects law and the law of the land. Can you explain a bit of that for us?
Yeah, so I think maybe the kind of best way of thinking about tikanga is as the first law of Aotearoa. You know, so we know that all societies develop laws and legal systems in order to manage social relationships, find ways of dealing with conflict or find ways of keeping people out of conflict situations. And so for Māori, you know, that's tikanga is our legal system. So the first law of Aotearoa. And, you know, one of the things that I think is important about Te Tiriti and the recognition of tino rangatiratanga in Te Tiriti is that provides a recognition of the authority of that legal system of tikanga. And so we know within tikanga that we have mechanisms for thinking about how we relate to each other. We have agreed systems for how we resolve disputes, about how we determine leadership, about what the accountability of leaders to a community is, all of the things that we expect a legal system to do.
Yeah. And has there been precedents where court cases have looked at tikanga and evidence and taken that into consideration?
Yes, there has. So the common law, which is the kind of law that we've inherited from England through court decisions and case law rather than through statutes and legislation. The common law always had the ability to recognise customary law. And so in Aotearoa, from quite early on, we see cases which are recognising that tikanga can be recognised as customary law. Now, that was always if you met the kind of tests that the common law set out.
Yeah.
You know, you had to show that this was a practice that existed and it was certain and people knew what it was about, that it had been in existence for a long period of time. In the case of Aotearoa, since 1840 was the date that was chosen, and that there was no legislation that kind of contradicted that or overrode that, and that it was also reasonable in terms of what the common law determined was reasonable.
Right, so you know if your tikanga was to behead someone that did something bad to you, then it's pretty unreasonable in terms of common law.
That's right. More recently, we've seen some cases that have started to recognise tikanga itself as a source of law, and even the Supreme Court talking about recognising tikanga as the first law of Aotearoa. And what we've seen is that the kind of one of the sort of big cases that recognised tikanga as the first law of Aotearoa and drew on it through the case was the Peter Ellis case.
Oh, really?
Yeah, and so in that case, the tikanga issue that arose, people might be familiar with the Peter Ellis case, as in the 1990s he was charged with a number of sexual offending against children. The Supreme Court has subsequently found those convictions to be unsafe. But the tikanga issue that arose was that the Supreme Court had agreed to hear Peter Ellis's appeal, and this is quite recently, it was in the last few years, but Peter Ellis died before the hearing of that appeal could take place, and the tikanga issue, or how tikanga came into the case, was to consider whether tikanga had anything to say about whether the appeal should continue even though Peter Ellis had died. Now, the kind of usual presumption, kind of common law presumption, would be that in a criminal case, if the appellant dies before the hearing, then the appeal ends. Yeah. But the Supreme Court asked the lawyers in that case, well, you know, there's no legislation that requires that to be the case. Given that we know that tikanga is a source of law in Aotearoa, does that have any impact on how, you know, on our decision in terms of whether the appeal should continue? And so in that case, they convened, the parties jointly got together a group of tikanga experts to wānanga this issue, and they provided a statement to the court which talked about the fact, to draw on tikanga principles like whakapapa and whanaungatanga to kind of point out that, Peter Ellis is not just an individual. He sits in a network of relationships that may have an interest in his guilt or innocence and his reputation. They drew on the idea of mana to kind of think about the idea that his mana doesn't just end when he dies.
Yeah.
They talked about ideas of utu and ea, and the idea that what tikanga Māori seeks to do is to restore a balance. And they identified that in this case, according to tikanga, they said that the Supreme Court has allowed this appeal. That has put things in a state of imbalance, and the Supreme Court needs to continue through to finish its process in order to achieve a state of ea or a state of balance again. No matter what the outcome is, it needs to finish through and follow through on its process. Now, one of the things that I thought was really interesting about this case is that there's no particular Māori dimension to the case. Peter Ellis isn't Māori.
Yeah.
It's not a kind of...
So it's not for Māori only?
No. And so this was made it clear that tikanga is part of New Zealand law and may apply as part of New Zealand law in particular circumstances. And, also the other thing that really struck me about it was that the idea that someone's family or community might have an interest in their reputation after they had died, I don't think that's a uniquely Māori idea. I don't think that's an idea that would be foreign to most New Zealanders. But the common law had kind of come out of step with where we are as a society, and tikanga was being used as a mechanism to kind of help bring the common law back in line with where I think most New Zealanders would sit on that issue.
And do you think it's going to be more common, people using tikanga in court cases? And in your experience, is the law community open to it, or is there any hesitation about it?
It certainly will become more common. It's already become more common just in the few years since the Ellis case was heard. I think even from when the Supreme Court started asking questions about whether tikanga was relevant, you almost immediately saw tikanga issues being identified and raised in a range of other cases as well. So it is becoming more common, and I think we will see more of it. There is some hesitation and different kinds of hesitation from different areas. For most in the legal profession, I think there is a concern that they may not feel fully qualified to be engaging with tikanga questions. And so there's a lot of work at the moment that, law schools are doing, that the profession is doing to try and upskill and make sure that they are thinking about, how to draw on appropriate expertise and not to think that they have all the answers, that they are tikanga experts, but to think about how to access that tikanga expertise where they need to. There are some, we've seen comments from some in the profession who don't believe tikanga is law. They don't think it constitutes law. Well, but they're a small minority, and we've seen all the professional bodies, the New Zealand Law Society, the Māori Law Society, the Pacifica Law Society, the Asian Law Society, all of these groups come out and make it clear that they are in support of recognising that tikanga is the first law of Aotearoa. I think, when we talk about the Crown, we often, we're talking about the sort of the government as a whole. And, I would certainly say that this current government is not a fan of tikanga or recognising tikanga as law. But as the Crown Law Office, who are the lawyers for the Crown, my experience is that they are interested in and comfortable working with and thinking about the ways in which tikanga might apply. And what we saw from the Ellis case is that, the Crown Law Office, they will take their cue from the ways in which the courts are engaging in terms of the way in which they engage in litigation. Now they have government as a client, which may create some tension for them.
Yeah. And so you teach this, and you also teach things about the tiriti in the time, like even from when you studied as a lawyer to the way that you teach now. Are the attitudes changing about te tiriti and how it's taught, and what that framework looks like?
Yes, definitely. So I started, when I taught at the law school for 15 years, I started at the end of 2006. And over that time, there was quite a significant change in terms of how students were coming into courses relating to te tiriti and tikanga Māori. So I taught a section in our public law course which talked about the principles of the Treaty of Waitangi as they've been engaged with by the courts. And when I first started teaching that, there was a sense that, the students felt that these cases were pretty reasonable in the way in which they dealt with treaty principles and Māori rights. By the end of that 15-year period that I was at the law school at Victoria, the students were asking more and more questions about why the courts had not gone further, why they were using quite a limited framework for thinking about and engaging with treaty principles, and could see, in fact, that this was not giving full effect to what's talked about in Te Tiriti. This was not a full expression of te rangatira. And I would say the majority of students were kind of left quite frustrated by the fact that these decisions, largely from late 1980s and 1990s, were, not dealing with te tiriti in the way in which they would like to see it dealt with, or had engaged with it in other kinds of contexts.
Because in those spaces too, it's hard, and it takes a while, right, to change the attitudes. Even if you wanted to change the curriculum, even like how we've seen it in kura at the moment, the curriculum has been away for so long. What is the process if you want to start changing some of that stuff so that people are getting the true history and they are getting the proper story?
Yeah, so, if we're talking about legal education, then what the courts do is really important, because this is partly why we've seen the law schools respond and we've seen the profession respond, is because the courts are engaging with tikanga and te tiriti in a different kind of way in which they have done previously. And so in terms of legal education, there's not really an argument, because the courts are doing this, so lawyers know they need to get up to speed and they need to figure out how they're engaging with te tiriti and tikanga. But, you're absolutely right that one of the really important aspects of all of this work is about ensuring that there's good information and good education around te tiriti and around tikanga Māori.
Even just making this kaupapa and through people I know, it seems like Māori lawyers are really, really busy at the moment. What kind of role do they play?
Yeah, Māori lawyers have a really important role, and so that can be through advocacy for clients and all kinds of, and through litigation, through Waitangi Tribunal hearings. Yeah. It can be in supporting settlement process and working with post-settlement governance entities and making sure that those entities are set up in ways which meet the needs of those communities. They are, at the moment, spending a lot of time working on submissions to address a number of the actions of the government which are proposed, and to try and stop some of those actions, or to try and ensure that the impacts for Māori are not as bad as they could be.
Yeah. I hear that word submission all the time. All lawyers, like, I've just finished a submission on this and a submission on that. Like, what is the role? Like, yeah, explain that to me.
Yeah, so sometimes lawyers, when they're talking about submissions, are talking about the arguments that they make in court, and that's one form of submissions that they make. But often they might be talking about like making a submission to a select committee. So this is the opportunity through the legislative process. As laws are going through Parliament, one of the stages is usually that there will be a select committee hearing, so a small group of MPs from different parties will take responsibility, have responsibility for a particular subject area, and there's usually an opportunity for anyone who wants to make a submission to the select committee on that bill or that law that's going through Parliament. And so that can be done in a very informal way. There's no kind of particular form that needs to take. It can be as simple as saying, I oppose this bill, or I support this bill, or you may want to include more reasons and evidence to support your position on that. But that's often also what people are talking about.
It feels like a pretty tricky time and a hard time for Māori at the moment. As someone who's kind of deep in this mahi, what are your whakaaro on the political climate at the moment?
Yeah, I think it is a difficult time. I think it is a hard climate, and I think we see a kind of onslaught of anti-Tiriti, anti-Māori policies from this government, and I think it's no accident. I think it's deliberately intended to make it a difficult time for Māori.
You talk about the way that the government is still breaching Te Tiriti. In your mahi in this space, what have been some of the main ways that they are doing that, do you think?
Well, we've seen over the last few months a range of Waitangi Tribunal inquiries about a number of different policies that the current government has pursued, including things like the disestablishment of the Māori Health Authority, the changing the requirements around the establishment of Māori wards. We've seen changes in relation to taku taimoana legislation being proposed, the removal of Section 7AA of the Oranga Tamariki Act. All of these things have been clear breaches of the principles of the Treaty of Waitangi, and the Waitangi Tribunal has made that very clear. But one of the things that we know as Māori is that we've been through difficult times before, and that actually, when you look around at some of the efforts and the movements around kotahitanga, the national hui that have been being held, the work that's being done not just at that national level but in bringing together communities or groups on all kinds of different issues. I think you can see the real strength and resilience of Māori communities. Now, it would be nice if we didn't have to fight against these things all the time, and we're able to focus our energy on just enjoying being Māori. But we know we can handle these issues because we know we've done it before.
Yeah. So let's skip forward 2040, 200 years on from the signing of the treaty. By then, what kind of role do you think it will play?
Well, I would like to see Te Tiriti playing a really fundamental role in providing a foundation for how tino rangatiratanga and kāwanatanga relate to each other. So how that sphere of Māori authority and the sphere of governmental authority relate to one another. And I think Te Tiriti provides the foundation for that and provides a kind of a blueprint or a framework for thinking about what that relationship can look like.
Carwyn, e mihi mai oha ana ki a koe. Thank you so much for coming and sharing your kōrero and your mātauranga with us. It's been great to talk with you.
Kia ora.
Ko te reo